All right, so good morning, everybody. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. If you're joining us for the first time, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world through over 50 live, free, interactive broadcasts every single month. It is such a thrill to have you guys back in the classroom and back joining us in this early school year. So nice of you to dive in with our featuring of scientists, explorers, conservationists, and more around this planet. We really appreciate it and hope you guys can join us for more very, very soon as well. Now, today is special for a number of reasons. It is Science Literacy Week. This is a program that I actually developed in Canada several years back. And as part of Science Literacy Week, it is the National Science Reading Day. So this is a special day in the middle of the week where we are encouraging classrooms around the world to take a little time to read something a little bit different, to explore the world and the cosmos through literature. As you can see with this big shelf behind me, books are one of my very favorite things. They inspired me so much as a kid and continue to do so today. And so hopefully we all get the chance to read a book. We're going to do a really cool program today highlighting just that. So another note in terms of why this is so special. Never mind the day, never mind any of that. The speaker we have on today is a person who went to university with me, a friend of mine, someone I've tried to get on this broadcast for 5 long years. I was but a wee lad when I tried to get her on for the first time. And so I'm so excited for you guys to join her today. We are joined live by Cylita Guy, Dr. Cylita Guy, who is a data scientist. She's an ecologist. She is the friendly neighborhood batgirl. When I talked to her a few years ago, her goal was to be the first Prime Minister astronaut, which I have no doubt she will one day accomplish in the not too distant future. It is such a personal and professional privilege to have her on. In fact, before we dive into the program, Cylita, just welcome in. Thank you so much for being a part of this today. This is great.
Good morning, Jesse, and thanks for what is perhaps the best hype man introduction I have ever received. It's kind of giving me a lot of energy on this cold, rainy day up here in Toronto.
Yeah, it's a little dreary, but we're going to blow some minds today. I know we're going to dive in a little bit about your career. We're going to dive into this incredible new book you have, and congratulations on that. And so I'm going to dip out of the broadcast because no one's here for me today. They are here for you. So I'm going to turn it over to you to blow our minds. Thank you again, and take us away.
Sounds great. Perfect. Thanks for bringing up my slides, Jesse, there. So good morning, everyone. I'm so excited to be chatting with you today. So once again, my name is Cylita. As Jesse mentioned, I'm a scientist who's based here in Toronto. And I want to spend some time talking about what type of scientist I am and what I studied as I was going to university and doing my PhD. So I am an ecologist. And if you haven't heard that word before, don't be worried about that. I didn't really know what an ecologist was until I started kind of doing my PhD. So while I was in university, but as an ecologist, I'm a type of scientist who studies the interactions between species. So you can kind of think of an ecologist, you guys probably do biology in school. You maybe learn about the planet and conservation and cells and the human body. Well, an ecologist is just a type of scientist who does some of that biology work. But what do I mean by interactions between species? Well, up here, it's a little small, but bear with me. We have a picture of a watering hole at the African savanna. And in this picture, there are a whole bunch of different species. There are elephants and zebras drinking from the water. There are trees and different types of grass species hanging out in the background. If we zoomed in close on that big body of water, there might even be some fish or some very, very small microorganisms that we need a microscope to see. And so as an ecologist, when I look at a picture like this, I want to know, what sorts of animals eat other animals, right? Like what animals eat the zebras? Do any animals try to, let's say, eat an elephant if they're able to? What happens if there are too many of one type of species or one type of plant or animal? For example, if we have too many zebras, are the elephants not able to get the water or the other resources that they need? These are the types of questions that, people like me, scientists like me ask about our different ecosystems and communities, okay? But as ecologists, we don't just ask, how do species interact? We also, want to understand why we find some species in certain places and not others. So in school, you may have learned that, some species can be found in certain places of North America and not others. We may find certain types of plants and animals and wildlife, in Europe, but not here in North America or not in South America. And so ecologists also want to understand why is that? Is it because of the environment? Is it because specific types of things they need to survive are found in a specific area, and why sometimes do those distributions change. But perhaps most importantly, as ecologists, we spend a lot of time thinking about why nature is important. So I want to pause here. I really just want to emphasize, just like every or other sort of creature on this planet, like all nature has the right to exist. But sometimes in order to help people understand why we need to protect nature and why it's so important to have big, healthy, intact forests, or big, healthy, intact tundra, we have to motivate people by showing the value that nature provides to humans. And we're going to talk about that value, or what we call ecosystem services, in just a little bit. All right. So I'm an ecologist. I study the interactions between species, but I didn't study kind of all species. I really focus on a very particular group of animals. I think they're the coolest group of animals out there, and that is bats. So this is a picture of me doing field work here in Toronto, and in my tiny pink gloved hand, you can see that there's what I'm going to call a small brown bundle of joy. So I'm holding a big brown bat by the name of Atticus. Atticus is one of over 300 bats that I caught right here in the city of Toronto. And I'm going to talk about why in a little bit. But, I want to spend some time talking about bats because, this is the group that I've spent a lot of time studying. I think they're absolutely incredible animals. They're just so interesting, but they get a really bad rep. Some people are a little scared of bats. They're a little creeped out about them, by them. Halloween is coming up, right? We often see them associated with vampires during the Halloween season. But the truth is, bats are pretty amazing animals because they basically have superpowers. I'm serious. Bats can do things that no other mammal can do. So first off, bats are like you and I. They are mammals. That means they give birth to live babies that they feed with milk. They're covered in fur and they're warm-blooded. Okay. But unlike all other mammals, bats are able to fly. Okay. They are the only mammals capable of true powered flight. And to give you an idea of just how special that is, the ability to fly has only ever evolved 4 times. So like 4 times in the history of our planet. Birds can fly, insects can fly, bats can fly. And that 4th group, in case you're sitting there kind of puzzling, being like, what's that other group of animals that can fly? Well, it was pterosaurs, who are the now extinct group of flying reptiles. Okay, but not only can bats fly, bats are nocturnal. They come out at night to feed while the rest of us have gone to sleep. But because they come out at night, many species have evolved this ability to use sound to navigate their nighttime environments. So most species of bats can echolocate. It means they make these high frequency noises, and these noises are well outside the range of human hearing. So you and I, we can't hear them, even though they're making these sounds. And these high frequency sound waves go out into their environments, they bounce off of objects, they come back to the bat, and they help the bat understand, that there's tasty bug over here I want to eat, but there's a tree over here that I want to fly around. So this, this biosonar, this echolocation helps them get around in their nighttime environments. And because bats can echolocate, some, not all, because most bats can echolocate, it's kind of led to this, I'm going to say this old adage or this old phrase that you may have heard called blind as a bat. And I want to say that this isn't true. Okay, bats aren't blind. The bats that can echolocate, their eyes are small, sometimes they're tucked away, but they can still see. And there are some species of bats, like this beautiful flying fox, that have never had the ability to echolocate. And instead, species like flying foxes, they rely on these big, beautiful eyes to help them navigate their nighttime environments. And trust me, they can see much better than you and I could ever hope to see in the dark. Okay. But the other really cool thing about bats, I'm telling you some things about bats in general, but the really cool thing about bats is there's a lot of them. There are over 1,400 different types or different species of bats around the world. Okay, bats are the second most species-rich group of mammals. They can be found everywhere except the high Arctic and the Antarctic, where it's a little too cold for them. And because there's so many different types of species, there's incredible diversity in this group. Just take a look. Okay, there are 12 bats up on this slide. It's a very small snapshot. A lot of them come from South America, but look at some of those crazy and wild faces, right? There's a bat down here in this lower section of the slide that has a mohawk. We're not really sure why they have those mohawks. There are some bats like this trident nose bat down here, or this spear nose bat just above, that have these beautiful, what we call nose leaves, right? We've got bats with long tongues. You've got bats with strange wrinkly faces. Sorry, excuse me, let me just silence that so it doesn't go off again. Right, so there's an incredible amount of diversity in this group. And I think one of the ways that this diversity is best demonstrated is in all the different types of things that bats eat, right? So by and large, most species of bats are insect eaters, okay? They feed on different types of bugs, anything from katydids, which is in the mouth of the bat that we see on this slide, to scorpions, which the pallid bat prefers to eat, and the venom doesn't seem to impact them, right? But there are also species of bats that feed on birds. There are bats that feed on rodents. There are bigger bats that feed on smaller bats. There are some species of bats that feed on fish. So lots of species that are carnivorous, okay? We also, though, have some species of bats that feed almost entirely on fruit. And there are a whole bunch of bats who feed on pollen and nectar as well, just kind of like bees or butterflies or other pollinators you might be familiar with. And I can't talk about diet without talking about our 3 species of vampire bats. So of the 1,400 different types of bats around the world, there are 3 species that feed exclusively or entirely on blood. Okay, we call this kind of type of feeding strategy, or we refer to these bats as being hematophagous. If you guys are sitting in your classrooms right now and you want to take a minute to say that word with me, say it out loud. It's kind of a fun word to say, hematophagous, right? That's what we call animals that feed on blood. And although it sounds like a disgusting way to kind of live your life, it's really kind of special because blood doesn't have a lot of nutrition, right? If you think about the broccoli you might eat for dinner, or perhaps the chicken or beans that you might have for dinner, those foods have a lot of nutrients in them, right, to feed your body. But these little guys are eating just blood. There isn't a lot of nutrients in them. So it's incredible that they've evolved to feed off of this. And don't worry, okay, these guys don't suck blood. Instead, what they do is they will fly down to, an unsuspecting prey while it's, asleep on the ground. These guys mostly feed on large animals, wild birds, or livestock. They'll fold their wings up and crawl over, and then they'll use their sharp incisors, or those really pointy teeth that you're seeing on that slide. And what they'll do is they'll just make a tiny little cut. The blood will pool in that cut, and then these vampire bats just lick up the blood, kind of like a cat licking up milk. So it's very cute to see. They don't kill their prey when they're feeding. They have their blood meal, and then they fly away, right? And so I want to point out, earlier I mentioned that as an ecologist, we often try to think about all of the value that nature provides to us, or what scientists often call ecosystem services. That bats provide us with a lot of value by eating all of the different things that they eat, right? The bats that feed on insects, well, by eating insects and sometimes by eating pests, they are acting as free pest control for things like our crops, right? The bats that feed on fruit, they move around seeds in landscapes, helping to make sure that, forests grow up big and healthy. And the species that feed on nectar, well, they pollinate a lot of plants in their local environments. And so we should actually thank bats because they provide a lot of really valuable ecosystem services. Now, when I was doing my PhD, I had the option to study some of these wonderful bats that I've just shared a little bit with you about anywhere in the world, right? I could have gone to the caves of Southeast Asia. I could have gone down to South America. I could have gone, west into the Rockies to study bats out there. But, instead of doing all that, I opted to study bats right here in the city of Toronto. So this is a satellite image of the city of Toronto. We've got the downtown core here over to the right. And off to the left, you'll notice kind of in the center of the image, there's this large green space. This is Toronto's Hyde Park. It is one of the largest fully urban parks in North America, in the GTA. And I spent a lot of time studying bats here in the city of Toronto, understanding how they were moving throughout Hyde Park. And the reason, that I did this, I'm going to explain a little bit in a second. There's a special, name for ecologists who study the nature within our cities. And we refer to these types of people, myself included, as urban ecologists. So I'm an ecologist because I ask questions about the interactions between species, but I'm an urban ecologist because, I ask questions about the interactions between species who live in cities. And the term urban ecologist, or the science study of urban ecology, is actually pretty new. It's something that's really, more and more ecologists have spent their time invested in the last 10 years. And so urban ecologists ask the same questions as ecologists do. They might just have a little spin on it, right? So here is an example of an interaction we might see in a city environment. We've got a raccoon feeding or eating dog food out of a dog's bowl, right? And so just like an ecologist looking at a picture of the African savanna might ask, how do all those species interact? Urban ecologists also want to understand how the species, in a city who might not normally, meet each other or encounter each other, how do they interact? And importantly, how do species living in cities change their behavior? And that was one of the things that I wanted to understand when I was studying bats in Hyde Park. I wanted to know how these city bats were changing their behavior relative to their country bat cousins, so bats that lived out in the wilderness. Okay, but urban ecologists will also ask questions like, what types of species do well in cities? There's a pigeon in the background there. Pigeons do incredibly well in our city landscapes. So do rodents, so do raccoons. But some species are missing from our urban environments. Some species of wildflowers, some species of insects. Well, at urban ecologists, we want to understand why that is. And perhaps most importantly, urban ecologists ask questions about urban nature, about plants, about animals, about all the critters we share our cities with, because we hope that by understanding these relationships, understanding these interactions, and learning more about what species need to survive in cities, we want to use that information to design cities that are good for both wildlife and humans alike. Because we know that having nature around is really, really important for us, and it's important for having healthy, functioning ecosystems. Okay. And this science, or this study of urban nature, of urban ecology, is going to be even more important going into the future. Currently over half, so about 55% of the world's population lives in a city, lives in an urban area. And the UN estimates that by the year 2050, okay, so that's not that long from now, over 65% of people will live in an urban area. So our cities are growing. And as our cities grow, it is essential that we learn how to live, happily and healthily alongside nature in our cities. We need to learn how to make space for nature in our cities, because that nature does a lot of good things for us. It also has the right to exist. And we know that having healthy ecosystems is good for our planet as a whole. And so this, science of urban ecology is something that I'm really passionate about. I am an urban ecologist. I think it's really cool. And so as Jesse kind of alluded to in this book, as we're meeting here on National Science Reading Day, I am excited to say that my first nonfiction book is set to come out on November 9th, and it's all about urban ecology. So I've written a book about the urban ecologist studying nature in our cities. Each chapter features a different urban ecologist. It starts off with a story from the field. It then talks about some of the experiments that these scientists are running and what they're learning about our nature in cities. And then each chapter ends with a challenge to you, the reader, to go out and explore and learn more about the nature that you share your city with, whether that's, in North America, in Europe, or somewhere else. And so in this book, we've got everything from, bears to birds to microplastics. You'll get to meet scientists like Rachel up here. You'll see she's decked out. She's standing in a stream in the middle of the winter. So Rachel actually studies benthic invertebrates, or very small organisms that live or overwinter in the bottoms of our streams. And she's trying to understand how plastic pollution in cities is impacting where we find and don't find these invertebrates. You've also got scientists like Chris Shell, and Chris is really cool. He studies coyotes in Utah. He's now down in California. He studied coyotes in Tacoma, Washington, and he really wants to understand, how the decisions we've made in city planning is impacting where we find and don't find coyotes. There's also Kaylee over here. Kaylee studies how diseases spread in urban rat populations and what we can do to, ethically control those rat populations. So this is a book that I am really excited about, and I can't wait to get it in some readers' hands. And I thought, given that this is National Science Reading Day, I would actually finish today by reading a short section from the book. So I also talk about my work in the book today, or in this book, I should say, Chasing Bats and Tracking Rats. And so I'm going to read you a very short excerpt from chapter 1, which is all about my work studying urban bats. So, chasing down big browns. How much does wildlife rely on city green spaces? I bet the last time you played at a park, you saw some wildlife sharing it with you. Birds in trees, squirrels running around, turtles sunning themselves on rocks. Parks and green spaces are often the closest thing to the natural habitats of animals and plants in urban environments. So we like to think of them as being good habitat for wildlife in the city. That's what I thought when I set out to study bats in Hyde Park, a large green space in Toronto, Canada. It seemed like the perfect habitat for city bats. Hyde Park is full of tall old trees that bats might like to sleep in. It also has a large pond that bats could forage or hunt for insects over. But after chasing bats around all summer, I barely caught any. Where were the bats going at night to feed? Where were they sleeping during the day? It didn't seem like bats were using the park at all. But as I was about to learn, in the most dangerous way possible, that wasn't quite the case. The park is closed. What are you still doing here? Pausing, I looked up at the large, grumpy police officer standing in front of the picnic table I was sitting at. Around me were a number of strange items. Test tubes for storing samples, a margarine container full of measuring tapes, a pile of tiny felt bags, and a kitchen scale. Beside me sat Krista, my bat-catching partner in crime. She and I were now several hours into processing the 25 bats we had caught in the chimney of a nearby house. I sighed. It was 1 o'clock in the morning, and it had already been a very long night. Earlier that evening, Krista had climbed a ladder and dangled herself in our roost trap over the side of a 4-story home. After searching all summer, we'd finally found our first bat colony in a neighborhood filled with old, large houses and trees, just a few blocks away from Hyde Park. The people living there had given us permission to climb on the roof that night. As the sun had set, I watched excitedly from a lower section of the roof as our trap filled with bats. After an hour, Krista had lowered a bag full of squirming bats into my arms. I had almost squealed at the thought of how much data we were going to be able to collect from them. Everything had been going perfectly until it had come time for Krista to get down from the roof. As Krista stepped onto the first rung of the ladder, she slipped. Krista had fallen from the ladder and tumbled towards the edge of the roof, but I had jumped forward and grabbed her by the belt just before she fell off. Thinking about it again had my heart racing. Krista's near-death experience had been stressful enough, and now the police officer shining his light in my face was giving me a headache. "Ma'am," the police officer said, snapping me back to the present, "please answer my question. What are you doing in the park?" I explained I was a scientist who studied bats living in cities. I told the officer about the 25 bats we'd caught and how we'd brought them to the park so we could collect information about them before letting them go. The police officer nodded and asked if he could see one of my bats. I held up my gloved hand. Inside my closed palm, a tiny brown face squirmed, trying to escape. It's a big brown bat, but they aren't really that big, I joked. The police officer didn't laugh. Where are the rest of the bats, he asked. Have you let them go already? I told him that we hadn't yet because it was a very cold night. Even though it was the middle of the summer, it was only 10 degrees Celsius or 50 degrees Fahrenheit. When bats get cold, they go into a hibernation-like state called torpor. Because they've dropped their body temperature to save energy, torpid bats are slow and sluggish and can't fly. I explained that we had to warm up all of our bats before we could let them go. The police officer's eyes got larger and larger until finally he put up his hand to stop me. Ma'am, he said, squinting, did you know that your shirt is moving? Well, I looked down. Sure enough, there were several squeaking lumps wiggling around between my sweater and t-shirt. Of course, officer, I grinned. Like I was saying, we have to warm our bats back up, so the rest of the colony is down my shirt and under my armpit, and it looks like some of them are just about ready to start flying again. The police officer shook his head and took off pretty fast after that. And so that is a small excerpt from my chapter of Chasing Bats and Tracking Rats. If you guys are interested in learning more about urban ecology, I hope you will pick up a copy of this book when it comes out on November 9th, and you can read further to learn more about why we were studying bats in Hyde Park in the first place, or you can spend some time asking me questions about that work now, if you'd like.
Fantastic. Cylita, what fun. If you want to come out of screen share so you can see us again, have a bit of a conversation, that was awesome. I've pre-ordered the book personally, and again, if you guys want to check out Cylita's website, or the Annick Press website, who graciously published the book, Chasing Bats, Tracking Rats. I'll make sure to bring up those links at the end and send them to all our registered groups as well. What a fun read. We've got near-death experiences. We've got bats down shirts. How do you beat that to kick off the beginning of a chapter? Cylita, let's dive in with questions. We've got our folks joining us live. We've got Miss Peterson's class joining us in McKay, Idaho. Welcome in on YouTube, you guys. But I'm going to head to Tuscaloosa, Alabama for our first question with Miss Foster's class. Come on in, guys, and take us away. Hey!
How far have you traveled to study bats?
So that's a great question. Unfortunately, not that far. Hyde Park is like I'd say in good traffic, a half an hour drive from my house. I've gone as far as 2 hours out of the city to study some of our Southern Ontario bats. But, before the pandemic, I was, getting ready for my first bat catching trip down in South America. Had to put a pause on that, but I'm hoping one day soon I'll head down to Panama or Belize to see some of the really exciting and exotic species that I showed you earlier.
Well, fingers crossed on that. We've actually featured Belize bats on our programs, and in your book, you mentioned Rachel Giles and Kaylee Byers, both of whom have joined us for broadcasts in the past. If you want to see half the Chasing Bats and Tracking Rats team, they've all been on Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants before. So very cool. Thanks, guys. All right, Mr. Shattuck, grade 6 through 8 today in Chalk River, Ontario. Come on in and take us away.
How many bats have you studied?
That's a great question. So the work that I've done kind of two types of work. I've done the field work in the cities that I've talked about where I was focused on one species and really, really diving deep to understand how they behave in cities. And so that was the big brown bat, one of our most common species of bats here in Ontario. But while I was in Hyde Park, I also caught, 4 other species. I caught red bats. I caught silver hairs. I caught, hoary bats, I should say 3 other species. And so the bats that I've actually studied and handled, I'll say one species in depth with a couple other species accidentally in our nets. But then the other type of work that I do that I haven't really talked about today is I actually would, use math and computer models to make comparisons among all of the species of bats around the world. And so one of the projects that I did during my PhD is I did a lot of reading about different types of bats that lived everywhere. I read papers, I read old books, I looked at like old natural history archives, and I used that information to compile or create a data set, so collect information on, over 800 types of bats from around the world. And so for those bats, I didn't get to handle them in real life, but I still was asking questions about their ecology and how it compared to other species across the world.
Great question, guys. Thanks for that, Cylita.
I also just added, I'm really excited to have a class from Chalk River here this morning because my mom is actually from Chalk River and I was there a couple of months ago. So
how about that? Small world. We will come back to you guys in a second, Mr. Shattuck, but that's awesome. You're our first Chalk River knower in the history of the program, so that's very exciting. How cool. Actually, before we go to our McKay, Idaho class on YouTube, I just want to stress whether you, again, our classes today are joining in cities. One of the things we did last year was Backyard Bio as a global nature campaign. I know our classes here took part in that and went and explored local biodiversity. Seek and iNaturalist are like the coolest apps ever. If you want to go out and explore that wildlife, take pictures, listen to recordings, see what you can discover. I really can't encourage them enough wherever you're joining from around the world.
Yeah. And I will say that in the book, we also talk about like iNaturalist, eBird, apps like this that allow, for everyone who lives in a city or elsewhere to document their local nature. Scientists often use that data, and one of the women in the book, she takes like a critical lens and she really looks at how community collected data, what it tells us and what it doesn't tell us. So that's another kind of topic of discussion in my book.
We could do all the topics. We're going to bring you back on as many times as you want. We'll just do it all. McKay and Ms. Peterson's class, they've got a few questions. So these are two quick superlative ones for you. Is the flying fox the largest bat? And what is the smallest species of bat? So biggest and smallest, lay it on us.
Yeah, one of my favorite questions. So the smallest species of bat, which is actually in competition for being one of the smallest mammals in the world, it's about the size of my kind of thumb. Or I should say thumbnail, top of my thumb. It is a Bumble Bee Bat, so very, very, very small. The largest species of bat is a type of flying fox. I think there are actually, 6 species that kind of compete for the largest. One of them being the giant golden crowned flying fox, has a wingspan of over 2 meters, which I can't even demonstrate how big that is. They are incredibly large.
Very, very cool. I really encourage all our classes to look up flying foxes. I know I think it's Zambia every year, millions of them gather for the fruit harvest there. It's one of the most incredible things in all of nature, and closer to home for some of our American friends. In Austin, I believe it is, they have the big bridge where the 2 million Mexican free-tailed bats come out every single day. That is so wild. One of the great nature spectacles on earth is in the heart of one of the biggest cities in the U.S. So neat. I absolutely love it. All right, let's head back to Tuscaloosa. We are ripping through these. I knew you'd be fast in Q&A, Cylita. Miss Foster's class, come on back in.
Have you ever been attacked by a bat? If so, what type of injuries do they cause?
Okay. So I think this is a really, really great question because a lot of folks are worried about being attacked, and it's something that we should think about as we're in spaces. So I will say I have never been attacked by a bat, in that a bat has never been out flying, living its best bat life, and they won't come out of their way to then, come down and bite you. Now, I am a wildlife scientist, so when I catch bats, we use these large nets that are called mist nets. A bat will fly along, get caught in a mist net, and then I will have to go and take that bat out. And so while we're doing that, I'm not going to say the bats are attacking me because I am the one who's gotten kind of in their way, but they will do things like bite and gnaw at our hands because we're handling them. We're causing a little bit of stress to them to collect the data that we need to understand them better. And so for that reason, we always wear gloves. But just like any sort of wild animal, if bats are threatened, they may bite. Their teeth are very, very small. They can, for most species around the world who are about the size of my palm, their teeth are small. They can cause cuts on the hand. But again, they're not going to do this unless we get in their way. So if we go and we try to grab them, or if we, disrupt their roost, that's when they're going to be stressed and potentially do that. I will say, kind of anytime I'm talking about bats, I'm talking about bat bites. Here in North America, rabies is a concern, right? Just like a lot of other wild mammals, bats can give rabies to humans if their bit. And so I've been vaccinated for rabies, but sometimes bats get into our homes. They may be flying around our rooms. Usually if we open a window or a door, they will get out. But if there's kind of a period of question where if a bat has been in a room with someone who's sleeping and you're not sure if they bit that person, or if you yourself ever find a bat and it bites you, the most important thing, tell an adult right away, head on down to the hospital. You can get that rabies vaccine and everything should be okay.
That was a very nuanced answer. I love that. And I think one of the things that unites a lot of our animal programs is this importance of respecting wildlife. You're very unlikely ever to be attacked by an animal. If you walk up and try and pet an elephant, you will be crushed. If you swim with crocodiles, they will eat you. But outside of a very select number of creatures on this planet, you're unlikely to ever be in a situation where harm will come to you unless you're doing something wrong to an animal. So again, you've had this experience, but you interact with them day by day. And like everyone who works with animals, you take a lot of precautions to make sure there's no threat. So I think that's a great question, guys. That said, a wildly immature follow-up. When you're done this broadcast, everyone should look up the Devil Bat trailer because it's the greatest Halloween movie of all time with Bela Lugosi and has bats attacking people, and it's the greatest single sound made in the history of film. So do check that out. All right, Mr. Shadowsclash, back to Chalk River. Come on for a serious question.
What bat is the most dangerous, and what bat is the most kindest or nicest bat?
Ooh, kindest bats. I like it.
Oh, that's a thinker.
No pressure.
I don't know.
So
I'm going to give a bit of a wishy-washy answer. So it's a great question. I just don't know quite how to answer it. So I'm going to say I don't. So when I think of like dangerous animals, I think of like when I go to the zoo with my partner and his son, and they say things like the hippopotamus is the most dangerous animal in the zoo because it can do some damage if you have a run-in with a hippo. But I can't say that there's a species of bat where I can really say like this is the most dangerous. So perhaps what I'll say is the one that potentially has the most unintended negative impact are those vampire bats that we were talking about because they feed on blood and because they can carry the rabies virus, they can spread that rabies virus in the landscape. And again, rabies is treatable if we get to it in time, but they do cause sometimes livestock fatality if they transmit rabies to livestock. It doesn't happen frequently, but it can happen. And sometimes they transmit rabies to humans. And so there's a huge economic dollar cost to vaccinating all those people who've encountered these vampire bats. But I want to stress that that doesn't make the bats dangerous. That just means that we need to reevaluate how we share the landscape with them, because part of the reason that they feed on our livestock or they encounter humans is because we're taking up more and more of their natural habitat. So to me, it's not that they're dangerous. It just means that we need to learn to live alongside them. And as for what bat is the nicest, I think they're all great. They all do really important things for our environment. So it's really hard for me to narrow it down to just one.
Yeah. I don't know about any specific examples of bats, but this idea of living with animals in a sort of sustainable way where both people and animals benefit. We had elephants on the other day as a topic, and elephants are really famous for trampling farmers' fields, and so farmers find that a difficult thing. It's their livelihood. So they used to put up big electric fences and things like that, and that was problematic for the elephants. So now they have hives of bees. They literally get honey from these bees, and the elephants won't cross the bee fences because they're afraid of the bees. And so these elegant solutions are increasingly around the world to sort of mitigate this wildlife and human conflict. We're seeing this with all sorts of species. So I think whether it's bats or tigers or elephants or lions and tigers and bears, it's a really cool world thing happening right now. What were you going to say, Cylita? Sorry.
No, I was going to say you also see similar conflict in a lot of tropical countries between bats and farmers, right? Those fruit bats feed on fruit, and if farmers are raising the crops, they can sometimes lose a lot of their crops to bats. So there's definitely conflict there. It's been a while since I looked into some of the creative solutions that perhaps folks are implementing that are good for the bats and good for the farmers. So I'll make that part of my homework from today.
All right, session 2 coming up soon. Miss Peterson's class, they have a great question. Now, you didn't talk about this much in your broadcast, but are scientists making any progress on battling white nose syndrome? Could you explain briefly what white nose syndrome is and what we're doing about it?
Yeah, so this is a really great question. And I will say this is kind of one of the areas that I have not focused a lot on as a scientist. And so for context, white nose is a fungal pathogen, so it's a type of fungus that infects bats. It originated in Europe, where it kind of lives or coexists with bats there. It was introduced by scientists, cave explorers here in North America, and our bats are not used to this type of fungus, and as a result, it's resulted in huge numbers of deaths of our local species local to North America. I think something like 6 to 7 million bats have unfortunately died since the introduction of white nose. And what it does is these colonies will get infected. This fungus will wake bats up in hibernation because they get itchy, they scratch. And as they continue to wake up throughout their hibernation, they actually burn through their fat stores too quickly and they can't make it through. And so across Eastern North America, this has been a huge issue. A lot of the species that I should have caught while doing my field work, like little brown bats, which used to be the most abundant species in many places in Ontario, are no longer here. And that is because of white nose. And so in terms of progress, it's been a while since I've looked into that body of work, but I will say we've definitely, through realization of this being moved around by humans and scientists like myself, we've changed a lot of the ways in which we study bats to make it less likely that we'll transmit. So I think it's slowed the spread of it. That being said, we have seen cases as far as the kind of western seaboard in the United States. Still a few of them, not a lot, not in high numbers. There's also been some work to suggest that, yes, white nose kills a lot of bats of some species, but the ones who remain may have some resistance to it. So there's been some kind of good news there, in addition to lots of other work working on compounds that can, kill the fungus without also destroying all the native fungus that live in our cave ecosystems that are really, really important. So I wouldn't say I have like a full-on good news story as in all of our bats are being okay, but as a result of white nose, I think there's been a lot more attention on bat conservation. There's been a lot more emphasis on why bats are important, and not to say that there's anything good about the introduction of white nose here in North America, but I will say there's been more money to study it and to study bats as a whole, and a greater recognition of how important they are for our ecosystems.
Yeah, what a fantastic answer. One thing our classes can do, so this is white nose is something that affects bats, frogs, and a lot of amphibians are having similar problems with these introduced pathogens coming over. So if you're ever traveling to a foreign country, if you're traveling to a really nice ecosystem, one small thing you can do is wash your shoes before you go. Some of the little things that can get caught, the dirt in your shoes, can actually impact other ecosystems in a big way. So a lot of scientists do this when they travel. And so it's a small thing, but we can all do it, and it really can make a big impact. Cylita, time flies and you're having fun. We're near the end of the broadcast, but I'd love to get one more question from each one of our live classes. So we can do like a rapid fire round with our.
Let's do it.
Dive into Miss Foster's class. Coming up first, Mr. Shadow.
Can bats kill humans with their diseases besides rabies?
Wow.
Yeah. Oh, so this is a really good question. And again, this is going to take up all the time. So yes, bats can carry pathogens that they share with our livestock, they share, with other wildlife, that they can share with humans. And we refer to this group of pathogens as zoonotic diseases, right? COVID-19, caused by the SARS-CoV-2 virus, originated from wildlife. It hopped on over into humans, and now it's impacting us. That's an example of a zoonotic disease or zoonotic virus, which some people believe originated from a bat, or may have gone from a bat to a bunch of other animals. Bats are also known to potentially carry things, like Ebola, SARS coronavirus, like MERS, Nipah, Hendra. These are all examples of viruses that they can carry. But I want to emphasize, so I spent a lot of my time studying these zoonotic diseases in my PhD. I want to emphasize that although bats can share these diseases with humans, a lot of other wildlife also share similar diseases. Rodents, we can pick up things from our livestock. And so I think sometimes when we hear about, diseases like rabies, like Hendra from bats, there's this kind of jump to vilify bats or make them seem like a bad guy. But actually, again, lots of other animals can share diseases with humans that can make us very, very sick. And we just really need to work to living alongside wildlife to make sure that these transmission events don't happen.
There's a whole scientific discipline now called One Health that you're increasingly seeing at universities around the world, where it emphasizes the fact that ecosystems and human health and animal health and conservation are all linked. And so it's really something that a lot of students are starting to learn about too, and it's a really, really exciting field. So I'm glad we got that question. Mr. Shaddis class, back to Chalk River. Finish us off, guys.
What's your favorite species of bat?
Ooh.
Such a hard question. I feel like it changes based on the day, but today I'm going to go with the spotted bat, Euderma maculatum. They're pretty cool. They're black and white. They've got these big old ears, and they kind of have this pattern on their back, which if you squint, it looks a bit like a skull and crossbones, which I think is just so metal. But I think they're one of my favorites because they echolocate at a slightly lower frequency, so you can actually, when I say you, I mean us humans, we can actually pick up some of their echolocation calls. And I had this really great experience. I was in BC a couple of years ago. I was hiking the West Coast Trail, and the only wildlife that I wanted to see was, one of these spotted bats. It was our final night on the trail. I'm standing at the water, at our campsite, and I'm like really upset that I haven't seen a bat, even though we had we saw otters, we saw bear, we saw everything you could possibly want to see. But I was like, I want to see a spotted bat. And as I'm thinking this to myself, one of them flies out over the water. I can hear the small pip, pip, pip of their echolocation calls. And I lost my mind. I was so excited. Nobody else understood what I was excited about, but it was kind of one of my favorite experiences I've had.
How nice is that? I'm in St. Catharines, Ontario now, and every night we can go out and have tons of bats around us, which is really cool. It was right beside a park. So special to me. I absolutely adore bats. And so what a fun opportunity today to learn a little bit more about the work that you do, about these really special creatures, and to encourage people to check out this book. Again, if you want to check out Cylita's website, if you want to check out annickpress.com, you can pre-order Chasing Bats and Tracking Rats. It'll be a lot of fun. I can't wait to get it myself. And we'll have Cylita back for a program when it is officially released. I hope all you guys get the chance to check it out till then. Before we wrap up today, Cylita, I'm going to bring in our class to say a big thank you in a minute, but is there one sort of central message you want all our kids to take home today about biodiversity or anything?
Yeah, so I would encourage, for those of you classrooms joining us from cities, our cities are surprisingly wild places. So get out there and explore the nature where you live. Don't think that you need to, drive outside of that city to really experience nature. It is everywhere. And for all of you, just wherever you are, continue to learn about, explore, and also advocate for and protect all of the biodiversity that you have in your backyard, your neighborhood, your schoolyard, and figure out ways that you can learn to coexist with it.
Cylita, what fun was that? Thank you so much for joining us here. I'm so thrilled to have you. And as we do at the end of every broadcast, I'm going to bring in Ms. Foster and Mr. Shaddis class to join me and say a big thank you and farewell. So guys, get that enthusiasm going. Have a wonderful